Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors in partnership with the Massachusetts Historical Society. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs at American Ancestors, the creator and producer of this author series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of America's history and women's history, exploring the life of Angelica Schuyler. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event. Soon, author Molly Beer will take the screen to discuss her new book, Angelica, For Love and Country in a Time of Revolution. Following her illustrated presentation, our guest moderator, historian Julie Flavelle, will join Ms. Beer for a discussion. In the last 10 to 15 minutes of our program, the duo will address your questions. We encourage you to enter your queries at any time during the program into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Tonight's talk is being recorded by my colleagues in our Brew Family Learning Center. The video will be shared in the hours ahead. As good as tonight's content might be, of course, the real pleasure and education comes from reading tonight's featured book. Copies of the biography Angelica can be purchased through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Input the code AMINS25 in the comments field as you order, and your book will come signed by the author on a bookplate. The bookstore can send these special copies anywhere in the United States to you, your friends, family, female historians, and fellow history lovers. Now, for some background on our guests, welcome to my counterpart at the Massachusetts Historical Society, Olivia Saya. Olivia, welcome.
Thank you, Margaret. Good evening. I'm Olivia Saya, Public Programs Coordinator at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I have the honor of introducing tonight's speaker, Molly Beer. Molly Beer was raised on a farm in the town of Angelica, New York. She is an award-winning nonfiction writer interested in history, women, politics, and place. She teaches at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And now I'll pass it back to Margaret to introduce tonight's moderator.
Thank you, Olivia. I am delighted to introduce our moderator to welcome her back to the series. Julie Flavelle was with us in the fall of 2021 with her book, The Howe Dynasty, a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and a finalist for the 2022 George Washington Book Prize. Dr. Flavelle is a dual US-UK citizen. She received her PhD from University College London and has lectured at Dundee and Edinburgh universities. Her dual life is just perfect for this evening. As you'll see, Angelica lived much of her life abroad and in the rarefied heights of political power, aristocracy, and nobility. Dr. Flavelle's Anglo-American perspective also inspired her first book, When London Was the Capital of America. We'll hear from her in the second half of the program, but for now, welcome to you, Molly Beer. Let's jump right into the story of Angelica. Over to you. We are thrilled that you're here, Molly, and there's so much to say, and your slides are super. So let's start right in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret and Olivia, to American Inspiration for inviting me to speak today, and of course the brilliant Dr. Julie Flavelle for joining me from England. Thank you to the Massachusetts Historical Society for sponsoring this event and Porter Square Books for getting you signed books. But most of all, I want to thank all of you history readers who are here today. This is an amazing crowd, and I'm so honored to talk to you today about Angelica. I feel like we are making good on Abigail Adams' long ago admonishment to remember the women. So, as you know, I'm Molly Beer. I'm a nonfiction writer, and up till now, the majority of my work has been about places. I was an international teacher in El Salvador. I was a correspondent in Mexico. I've traveled across Tibet in tractors and boats. And I wrote about travel and culture clash and international relations. Now, Angelica looks like a very different book from that. It's a biography of a historical figure, but for me, this is a deep dive into place as well, both the United States and my hometown. So I grew up in Angelica, New York, which is a small town in Western New York, about 70 miles upriver, as in south, from Rochester on the Genesee. And since my hometown was founded by Angelica Schuyler Church's family and named for her, I grew up learning American history through the lens of a female founder. In my childhood, who was Thomas Jefferson? He was a friend of Angelica's in France. Who was Alexander Hamilton? He was Angelica's brother-in-law. And so I just had that unique experience, and when I set out to write this book, I thought that there were more American women who might benefit from seeing the story through that perspective. So let's dive in. We'll take the first slide. So if you didn't grow up in Angelica in New York as I did, your first knowledge of Angelica Schuyler Church probably comes from her as being the sister-in-law of Alexander Hamilton, if you've heard of her. And Alexander Hamilton is most often remembered for these pistols, with which he fought his 1804 duel with the U.S. Vice President Aaron Burr. These are hair-triggered dueling pistols purchased in England by Angelica Schuyler Church's husband, John Barker Church, before they returned to the United States. And before Alexander Hamilton made use of them and carried them to Weehawken, they had been used in several duels. In 1799, John Barker Church, Angelica's husband, dueled himself with Aaron Burr, who was his colleague then at the Manhattan Company. And in 1801, more tragically, Alexander Hamilton's son, Philip Hamilton, borrowed these pistols from his uncle, and Philip Hamilton II, who is Angelica's son, Philip Church, carried his cousin home to New York to die. Now, so much of history is told through guns and pistols, between conflict between men and beginning and ending when shots are fired. But I'm interested in a woman who wasn't present on the dueling ground, but it had everything to do with managing what those duels meant, especially in a time of intense party spirit, as the U.S., the case of the turn of the 19th century and the transition from federalist rule in the new United States over to, as Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans are starting to come into power. So a lot of partisanship and a lot of tension, and and the country's just getting started. But Angelica and many women like her saw it as women's work to sit upon the pistol case, to prevent the fighting, to enact the peace, which is an important part of any war. So enough with dueling. Let's talk about Angelica's role in the American Revolution. So the next slide. So she isn't even Angelica in the beginning. This is one of the challenges of researching women, is that their names change all the time. She's actually born Angelica Schuyler in Albany, New York, which is formerly Beverwyck, New Netherland. She descends from Dutch landowning families who had colonized New Netherland before the British took over the colony. She's born right at the beginning of the French and Indian War. She's probably conceived when her father gets the news that he has been commissioned a militia captain. Her father is summoned home from the front to marry her mother the week of the Battle of Lake George, and she's born that February, so really right at the onset of the war. And so she grows up in war. She's born into war, in a house during a war run by women. Her grandmother was a widow, a merchant. Her mother was a very influential woman. She was Katerina van Rensselaer. In addition to that, they're very educated. There's lots of reading. She was she went to boarding school when she was very young to learn to read more. But this is the world where she starts out. Albany's remote, but it's also multicultural. There are Dutch, there are German Palatines, there are English soldiers, there are Mohawk and other native tribes that come into town to trade, and there are enslaved Africans, including living within Angelica's family home, as shown in this next slide, which is this really remarkable painting. Child of the Van Rensselaer family was servant, circa 1730, which is her... Katerina van Rensselaer Schuyler, her mother, is born in 32, so about that time period. And the degree, and it's a wonderful painting to sort of picture what those relationships were, and to get even more specific on it, in the Dutch families, in the prominent landowning Dutch families, they even had a ceremony that they performed when children were matched together, a master child and an enslaved child, where the master child would give a pair of shoes to the child who had been picked to be raised alongside them. So that's how closely and how intrinsically the enslavement was happening in her household as a child. And again, it's a colonial space. So they're doing that work of populating the land, controlling the land, breaking land, building, and so forth. And that's the world that she's born into, but it changes very quickly. So if we skip forward a decade, we get to 1766, and the next slide. Now, Angelica grows up in a Dutch-speaking household, but during the French and Indian War, British soldiers are living in people's homes, in their households, and so English is becoming more prevalent, even within the household, even in families where the servants and the women and the children are speaking Dutch. It's becoming more of it's entering the private sphere as well. By the end of the war, Angelica's family is starting to embrace British society and see that, see assimilation as their way forward in the colony. So they move out of the old family house. They build a new house in the English style right outside of Albany. It's called the Pastures. Angelica's father sails to England to buy some furniture for it, to make it just be that sort of English high life house that would help them sort of grow and raise their station in the colony. And it's so successful that in 1766, the royal governor of New York comes to stay at their new house. When he comes to visit Albany, he's just been appointed sort of in the midst of the Stamp Act upheaval. Sir Henry Moore comes to New York, and he gets along so well with the Schuylers, stays for several weeks, that when they return to New York, the royal governor invites Angelica to come and live in New York with him, with his family, in his family. So right in this picture, you have Royal New York in 1766, roughly, and then you see Fort George on the tip of Manhattan. And so she goes to live in the British fort on Manhattan. This will help her with her English. This will help her learn how to live in a British household. It's an educational experience for her, but it's also very significant for what it symbolizes between Albany and New York City, and the Dutch families and the colonial families and the British administration. So this is a 10-year-old child who is embodying this bridge between these two spaces at a time of very tenuous politics. The Stamp Act has just been repealed, but things have been very tense, and so she's a symbol at that point as a child. And then in this next slide, this is partly to show you the research materials that I found. You think looking for women's stories that they're not there. They've been thrown away, or they were never saved, or they weren't writing, or they weren't being captured. Nobody knew. You hear all of this, but when I opened this story up and started to research it, it's like one of those touch me not plants. It just exploded open. There was so much material. This is a letter by the royal governor to Angelica, who, when she goes to New York, her name becomes Angelica. She starts to be called Angelica, and she's called by her English name from then on. And this is the royal governor admonishing her father for not mentioning her in his last letter. Miss Schuyler desires I would inform you that she is extremely shocked that you make no mention of sending your duty to her. So this is official business, and she's part of it. All right, next slide. We're going to skip forward another 10 years. A lot goes on in between, but you have to read the book. This is July 4th, 1776, and this is the first sort of public piece of writing by Angelica herself. Now, Angelica's father, Philip Schuyler, is now one of the 4 major generals in command of the Continental Army under George Washington. And he's commanding the Northern Department, which is guarding against invasion from They're definitely expecting a counter invasion from Canada after the debacle under General Montgomery and the previous winter. And so General Schuyler is out traveling around to the different forts in northern New York, and his daughter sends him this letter, which contains important information and is obviously intended to be shared, talking about the conspiracy theories that are going on in New York, trying to overthrow George Washington. So she's become a public. She's starting to make these public letters, and she's starting to participate in the war. Her home is now a military headquarters. And it's all around her now that the war has broken out. And she's 20. So she's really young, but she wants to be involved, and her family and her household are definitely all part of the war effort. But then, a year later, after this Declaration of Independence is published, she doesn't know it yet when she writes this letter on July 4th, 1776. But a year later, Miss Schuyler declares her own independence. And here's the next slide. She goes from dutiful child to Mrs. Angelica Carter. This is John Carter, who comes to Albany on behalf of the Treasury Department, and he's supposed to audit the Northern Army because there are complaints that the Dutch New Yorker is absconding with funds or misusing funds, and some of this, the Schuyler's allies think that this is General Horatio Gates trying to take over his command, and that conflict rolls through. But while all of this is going on, Angelica's falling in love with this Englishman. He's not Dutch. He's not a New Yorker. He has no family connections whatsoever, which is so important to her family, which has been intermarrying for generations to control that Hudson River land and to keep the Dutch culture alive for over a century of British rule. So that has been kind of critical to the family. But no, this guy has none of this. And the Schuylers tell her no. But he speaks French, he reads poetry, he plays cards, and all the other eligible bachelors are off fighting the war. And John Carter, whose only credential at this point in the war is that he has provided information, a report about what's going on in Boston to the Continental Congress, because he was captured off a ship early in the war. So he has probably pledged his honor not to take up arms, and thus he's open to marriage. And so, while the British are invading from Canada and threatening to seize Fort Ticonderoga, Angelica sneaks off with John Carter to Massachusetts to get married. And it's a bad week for General Schuyler, whose daughter elopes and who also does lose Fort Ticonderoga. And then whether to escape their mother's anger or General Burgoyne's forces, they leave Albany and they go to Boston. And she will spend the rest of the war pretty mobile. But I'll talk about Boston for a second because we're here with the Massachusetts Historical Society. In Boston, Angelica does this thing that sort of that symbolizes the role that she plays going forward in adulthood, which is that after the Battle of Saratoga, where General Burgoyne and the British and German forces under him have surrendered and pledged not to fight in that war anymore, and effectively become prisoners of war and marched to Cambridge from Saratoga. They are going to be there indefinitely. And they've just spent 9 days staying with the Schuylers in Albany when the officers arrive. And so when they throw a party in Cambridge, they invite Angelica and her sister Elizabeth, who is living with Angelica at this time in Boston, to come to the party. The Boston selectmen say don't go, but Angelica and her sister do go dance with the British generals at their ball in Cambridge. Not to honor them, but to honor the peace they have agreed to. And if the peace is real, if the surrender at Saratoga is to be realized, then it has to be treated that now we're friends and we move on, and that's the next step. Okay, so Boston and the war goes on. There's lots of things. her husband's privateering. She's trying to be a hostess, but burns down her house. It takes a while. They're a young couple. But in 1780, General Rochambeau's French expeditionary forces arrive at Newport, and John and Angelica, who both speak French, attach to that army. And that's how they spend the rest of the war. And so the next slide is John Trumbull's painting of the surrender of Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown. And you have the French army on one side and the American army on the other side. And Angelica is actually with John Trumbull when he's collecting some of the portraits in France of these officers for the painting. So Angelica, feels essential to this army, travels with them, and I'm not gonna, there's the whole revolution unfolds. She's a little bit like a Forrest Gump of the American Revolution. So much happens, but again, read the book. I'm gonna skip forward to France because Angelica's attached enough to the French army and to France that when the war ends, she and John and their oldest child, Philip Carter, they sail to France. And the next slide, as it turns out, she's going to spend the next 14 years in France and England. And she doesn't anticipate that when she leaves. She thinks she's going on a tour. But when she arrives, it's amazing. It's the Age of Enlightenment. 1783 is the Annus Mirabilis, the Year of Wonder. The first hot air balloons are flying over Paris. Louis XVI is king. Marie Antoinette, who is the same age as Angelica, is a beautiful queen with a wild streak. That year, her portrait in a muslin dress and a straw hat caused such a scandal that the painter had to redo it. And Angelica loves the King and Queen of France, as many Americans do at this point, because they have backed the war for independence with money, supplies, ships, and soldiers. And Angelica has seen this firsthand, traveling with Rochambeau's army. As for John Carter, while he's in France, he gets paid for his work supplying the army. And with the money he earns, he goes to England. And when he comes back, he has news. He's bought a house in Piccadilly, and he has a new name. And so just after her 20th birthday, after 7 years of marriage and having not yet named the baby she gave birth to in Paris, who's her fourth child, Angelica Church, now Angelica Church, his name is John Barker Church, they sail to England, and she travels to Great Yarmouth on the North Sea to meet her mother-in-law for the first time. And for the range of that, she's in England. And here's a painting of, the next slide is of a painting that I want to show you briefly because I think it embodies what her role is there. And that is, so these are two paintings. They're both done by John Trumbull, who also comes to England that year. He's going to resume his studies. He had some trouble. He was arrested after John Andre was killed for espionage. They rounded up Americans in England, and he was studying art. But now he's returned, now that the war is over and there's amnesty, and he's studying under Benjamin West. Now, Benjamin West painted this painting in 1783 of King George III and Queen Charlotte's son Octavius. Unfortunately, he's just passed away from his smallpox inoculation. But John Trumbull takes the painting and makes an almost copy of it. Now, John Trumbull's doing this work representing the Americans and the American war, especially abroad, and he draws an American child who is presented as an equal to his British counterpart, as a leading child of the British, and this is a leading child of the We the People, and this child is holding a musket instead of a ceremonial sword. He has his hat with the feather instead of the cockade signaling the prince's military rank, and so forth. So they have these two images, and this is what Angelica sort of sets herself up to be, the American woman in Europe. And then in 1787, look at the next slide. We're going to do this very quickly because I'm running out of minutes. Then in 1787, Angelica and John Trumbull, who are great friends, they go to France and one of the letters they carry is from John and Abigail Adams, who are announcing that they are returning to the United States. and they've been granted permission for this. And Angelica sees this as a really critical moment because she would like to have a legitimate diplomatic role in England. She's been having sort of a de facto role. She would like more of it. And she goes with John Trumbull to meet Thomas Jefferson, who has that position, who's minister plenipotentiary, to France for the US. And her friend Maria Hadfield, the artist, is really her closest friend in England. And she was supposed to be there too, but she hasn't. So Angelica spends the winter with Thomas Jefferson. She enrolls her daughter in school with the Jefferson girls and gets to know him. And he tells her things like, the tender breasts of women were not, the tender breasts of ladies were not formed for political convulsions. And she responds by sending him leather-bound volumes of the Federalists that her sister, Elizabeth Hamilton, sends to her. And she begins her campaign to have her father appointed to the minister plenipotentiary to the court of St. James, which doesn't happen. And here's the next slide. This is just a letter that she writes from England. She's sad, but it shows primarily her position. She writes, she's helping people, Americans who come to England to see what they need to see, meet the people they need to meet. She can set up dinners with people from Parliament to discuss potential negotiations, but the U.S. doesn't want to send a minister because Britain hasn't sent one to the U.S. But she does say, "What are kings and queens to an American who has seen a Washington?" All right, her most relevant period of her life takes place next, and that's the French Revolution. That's our next slide. This is the Marquis de Lafayette in the center. So General Noy, who was fought in I forget his rank in the American War, who was a veteran of the American War, and on the right is Talleyrand, who did not himself fight in the American War. He had a clubfoot, but his brother did, and Angelica knew him in the French army. And so when the French Revolution takes a turn for bloodshed and the terror begins, her home becomes an American haven for veterans of the American Revolution, for French officers from that who are now fleeing their own revolution. And she helped several of them reach the United States, or their brother, Talleyrand. And she's not able to help Lafayette because he's imprisoned in Austria, but she does lobby for him, and then she does, when a prison attempt is made, when he's located and a prison attempt is made, Alexander Hamilton writes to Washington that clearly the church's fingers are all over that. So she's involved with that too. She sees it as very important that the alliance be recognized still, that France's role in the American Revolution be recognized and remembered and honored. And so that's a time when she's really an American representative functioning in Britain. And then the next slide, in 1797, finally she returns to New York, and they make a big splash. I mean, they charter a ship called the Fair American. They move into the government house, which was built for President Washington, although the capital moved, so we never lived there. And then John Jay and his wife, Sarah Jay, both cousins of Angelica, were going to live there, but then they moved the capital of New York to Albany, so that's not happening either. So the house is empty, and the churches take it. And so Angelica has the big prominent house in New York. They come back as if they have lots of money, which is maybe a little untrue, but they're really ready to take on a big role in the United States, finally, at long last. And it just doesn't work out that way. There's just a series of calamities. It starts with the Maria Reynolds affair with Alexander Hamilton and devolves all the way to the duel in which Hamilton is killed. And in the midst of that, she loses her nephew Philip. She loses her own son Alexander. She loses her sister Peggy and both of her parents. It's just a catastrophic period of her life. And she might have been demoralized, and she was for a while. It's a brutal turn of the century. But in 1806, we get our final slide. In 1806, Angelica is 50 years old. This is the year the Corps of Discovery, led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, is still out exploring the American West. And Angelica travels 450 miles by sloop, stagecoach, and saddle to reach the land her family has acquired as much by accident as anything else on the newly opened New York territory. John Barker Church is a sea guy. He's not a land guy. He would rather be merchant trading and so forth on ships than own land like her family, but that's what's happened to them. So she heads out to spend the summer slapping mosquitoes in the only wood frame house for 50 miles around. But of course, she's Angelica, so she does that with a French chef and a set of formal dishes. Thomas Jefferson, her friend, called her country mad, and maybe she was. But in Angelica, in this space that isn't even built yet, she's imagining a new American town. And this is that period of westward expansion that's just about to get started, where we're drafting and redrafting and inventing and reinventing what American society will look like. And we spent a lot of time talking about how a government was created, but how the society was created is a big part of how the country came to be also. And women were very much a part of that. And for Angelica, it's an act of idealism, a next horizon. And in that, it's an act that's quintessentially American. So that's what I have, and in abridged form. And now I'd like to welcome Dr. Julie Flavelle for questions, and we can dig into this.
Right. Thanks, Molly. It was an absolutely fascinating book. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
To kick off, I just wanted to ask, in the book, you call Angelica Church an iconic woman of the revolutionary generation. So can you talk about what you mean by iconic and maybe frame it in the context of those two very well-known women founders, Martha Washington and Abigail Adams?
Absolutely. So Angelica is a younger generation from Martha Washington and Abigail Adams. She's 19 when war breaks out. So she's more like Marquis de Lafayette or Alexander Hamilton, like those young officers of the war. She's a kid. So she's not in a leadership position at that point, but she's a prominent woman in the sense that her family, when you talk about, like, she's a very privileged person. She has been raised for leadership, as and her mother is more akin to the Martha Washington and Abigail Adams. Katrina Schuyler is that figure, is more that generation, and maybe that figure from New York State, and she's storied too for that period. But Angelica, she's iconic because she really just puts herself in public spaces. For a researcher, it's a huge advantage that she's not married to someone we remember a lot. Like when we talk about Abigail Adams, it's hard to separate her from John Adams. When we talk about Martha Washington, it's hard to separate her from George Washington. Like, so they're more of a joint unit, which means that it's him. But Angelica,
she's not overshadowed by her husband. Yeah.
She's not overshadowed, and her power is separate. Like, because he's English and she's American, and he borrows her power, but he also doesn't check her power. She wants to go to France and with John Trumbull and meet Thomas Jefferson. He seems to be cool with that. So he really lets her take that role, and she takes it. So by iconic, I mean she's prominent from childhood, like that she's, a child who is writing, or a teenager who is writing to the front, to the major general. And, she's prominent later when she's writing to President Washington, because she has ideas about what he should be doing. But she sees herself as a leading woman, and she lives that life, and she lives out prominently. And when she comes back for George Washington's inauguration without her children, there's one letter that says, it was George Washington and Mrs. Church vying for public attention. She tried to upstage the first president.
And it's also interesting that she's from New York, and Abigail Adams from New England, and Martha Washington from Virginia. They both kind of embodied their regions too. And I think having a sort of an iconic revolutionary woman from New York, as you say, she was multicultural, more so certainly than Abigail Adams, probably than Martha Washington. And that was something America needed at that point, was women who knew how to move in European circles and so forth. And one of the things I wondered about reading the book her parents obviously groomed her to be, they didn't want her to just be some upstate girl. They wanted her to go learn to move in social circles in New York City, speak English, and have genteel manners and so forth. And yet, wanting her to be part of a wider world. But at the same time, every single one of the Schuylers' children eloped, except for Betsy, who married Alexander Hamilton. And so I thought, what do you think of that? Were they kind of sending their kids mixed messages like, be yourself, be empowered, and then don't marry anyone we don't like? Or, because I was really struck by that.
Right. And Peggy marries her cousin of Van Rensselaer, marries the patroon. I mean, you'd think they'd be delighted, but.
Yeah, I know. Like they always ended up eloping.
My guess is that Katerina Schuyler had very clear plans for the children.
Right. Okay. So she knew who she wanted them to marry. Right. And they just said, no, mom. Right. Okay.
That's my guess, but she didn't write it down. So.
Yeah, well, that's, you show very clearly that Angelica really enjoys being challenged by moving between different cultures. And that's really clear throughout her life. Do you think that explains her choice of John Barker Carter as a husband? Because I'm a little bit with the parents on this. I mean, this guy appears, he doesn't have any family, he doesn't have any money. And in fact, of course, they subsequently find out that he left England because he was a bankrupt. Do you think Angelica was a little bit taken in by this man in 1777? He arrives in upstate New York and he seems to know English authors and he has English manners and he knows how to play cards and he's set off to advantage up there in the wilds of Albany. And do you think in the end, she was happy with her choice? Was it a good marriage?
I mean, I think that's a wonderful question, the good marriage question. And, marriage is long and they have a lot of children together. They seem to enjoy each other's company. I mean, there's things that, when there's a point where John Barker Church sails back to New York and Angelica doesn't go because Philip is at Eton and she has a baby and she's like, I'm not going to leave him there. And so she stays in England and doesn't get to go. And he returns and he picks up the two children that they left with her parents in Albany and brings them back to England. And he writes about the children with so much affection and they're little. And he's like, we're drinking, our cow gives us milk for the syllabubs. And the kids got really upset when it was stormy the other day. And, they were like, why can't you make it stop, Dad? So he seems like he's a sweet parent. He seems to really let her be her. He's got plenty of money to do it. He doesn't rein her in. He does not rein her in. And so, what goes on between two people, and I do not have their letters between the two of them. Those, if those are lost or very tightly held. So I don't know them speaking to each other. So I'm always looking at the marriage from the outside, and we're always looking at marriages from the outside, even if you do have the letters. But they're complicated. I think she may very well have been taken in. But I think also her options were limited. And I think she was ready to join the war in more ways than like as a kid and, taking orders from her mother. And I think she was ready to go out and do it.
Maybe she also thought that if she married this Englishman, she was definitely not going to stay in upstate New York. I mean, she seemed like somebody but it sounds from what you're saying, like they had a happy domestic life, a family. They both had a sense of family, which is important. And and he wasn't, I mean, you hear about Thomas Jefferson, he seemed like a control freak with the women in his family. So it doesn't sound like that happened. And during the American Revolution, I mean, one treat for the readers is, you said she was the Forrest Gump of.
Yeah, sorry about that. I can't help it. It's just so true.
Yeah, she was near Saratoga when Burgoyne was heading there with his army, and then she was in Boston when he surrendered and came there, and she was in Newport and she met Rochambeau and Philadelphia and Yorktown, and in the process she met a lot of high society Europeans. She met the von Riedesels in Boston and French aristocrats and of course English aristocrats. And I was thinking, I mean, this experience in America was almost like an apprenticeship for mixing with high society. And that would very much stand her in good stead in London, because of course in London, in a day when there weren't purpose-built public buildings. A lot of political business went on in great houses of private homes.
Yes.
And there were political hostesses like the Duchess of Devonshire who had a lot of control over who met who. And these places were very important. And in fact, I know that when Europeans came to Washington, D.C. early on in the New Republic, they were looking around saying, where are the salons? Where are the political salons? Because this is how we function in Europe. And I think Angela, I mean, you talked a little bit about this. Angelica effectively wanted to become an American political hostess, and that was her goal. So can you describe a bit her English social life? People like Lady Melbourne, who was a scandalous figure, who you said she lived right next door to her. I mean, who she mixed with in English high society?
Yeah, so she asked the Melbournes to take down the wall between her back garden and their much more palatial garden when she was throwing a party. So yes, Lady Melbourne, I don't have communication between the two of them, but Anne Damer, who was also friends with Lady Melbourne, lived on her street, and there, you hear about her statues. She was a sculptress and a blue stocking, often wore pants, and I know you know that, but just to fill that out. But so her statues would sometimes be on the street that Angelica also lived on, and in the mist that would confuse people because it looked like someone standing there. So there's her. I mean, definitely the art community was her focal point. Maria Causeway,
She's fascinating.
She is very fascinating. So her connection. So her husband Richard Causeway is the official portrait to the Prince of Wales, who also comes to Angelica's parties. Richard Causeway and the Prince of Wales come to her parties, and so it's liberal-minded British, French people in England who.
And her husband gambled with Charles James Fox, didn't he?
Yes, and Charles James Fox was someone who would be at her dinners. So Gouverneur Morris or John Jay would meet him at her house to sort of, to feel him out on, English politics. And he was a good friend of John Barker Church's. So yes, in England, she's certainly in that milieu. And when she returns to New York, I think she fully intends to run things, frankly. And I think that's the big house. They came back at this, I could never substantiate, but there's oral history of a set of all silver plates that they were going to serve their dinners on. They had the only set in New York. Yeah.
It's clear when she was in London, her husband was an MP. You mean, obviously you couldn't fit all this in when you were discussing it, but her husband was a member of Parliament, and she mixed in these very high-ranking circles, and for example, the Prince of Wales, that would have been very important to Americans coming to London, that she had these kind of contacts, and I could, reading your book, it's obvious that people thought of her house as a place to drop in.
Yes.
And a place to make contacts. And so it's interesting that you say when then she went to New York City, she obviously had the skill set to do this. And the Adamses did not. I mean, people commented on how out of it they were klutzy Bostonians.
I think she tried to help them.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
But all in vain, eh?
I don't know. She would take Nabby to the theater and get her out of the house. And
But when she got to New York, now I'm recalling, was she able to reestablish herself as a hostess there, or did that not really work for her?
She did to a certain extent. New York was a little scandalized. She'd do things like receive callers lying in her golden daybed in French style, and
a little too European.
It took her a while. But she was still involved. I mean, so, and it's easy to imagine that like how the United States was formed was how everybody like planned it to be formed, but they were certainly working on, talking about this at dinners. Like, well, what is the government going to be? What kind of, so those salons however, to the extent that they were salons in the United States were doing that. And I think she was very involved with that. I mean, also with her cousin, Robert Livingston, who was a Democratic Republican, opposed to discussing Napoleon and, what about a consular government? Like, would that be functional? I think she was involved. I just think the power, like the Thomas Jefferson, when his administration comes into power, she just doesn't have the same access, and just the wave of tragedies. Life happened basically.
Mm-hmm.
And,
yeah. So, now one of the things I wondered was, it's really striking in your book that so many of the women in your stories had large families, but they were right in the middle of events. And you just mentioned somebody had a baby, and then she hurried over to visit someone in the next state or something like that. And I remember you said John Jay's wife, Sarah, was hosting weekly tea parties for Americans in Paris. And at the same time, over a period of few years, she had 2 babies. And Angelica, of course, had children, had 8 children altogether, I think. But these women, they just didn't stop. They just carried on through pregnancies, childbirth. They kept on pursuing what they felt were public goals. Did you ever get the impression of how they felt about that? Did you think they felt childbearing ever got in the way? Did they ever get postnatal depression, anything like that?
They certainly did. Elizabeth Hamilton met Alexander Hamilton when she was staying with her aunt Gertrude in Morristown, helping to take care of her. She was having a great deal of depression that their family was discussing fairly openly. She had lost her first husband and her first son, and then remarried with her daughter, and then had but needed more support. And so, sending your daughter to go help your sister manage her life and her children because she was struggling was real. Sarah J certainly struggled when she was in Spain before going to France. She lost a baby horrifically, and was very alone in Spain. John Jay couldn't follow the court, and the Spanish court was always moving around, and Sarah J was sort of, in Madrid and by herself with, it's like her and her enslaved maid Abby, and trying to sort things out where they don't speak the language and so on. And in France, she's alone too. After the signing of the peace treaty, John Jay and John Barker, they all go to England because of the amnesty, and John Jay goes to Bath for a few months to recover from signing some papers. I know, I love this stuff. This is where I really find history. And so Sarah J remains in Paris looking after Benjamin Franklin and her children and trying to manage things there. The childbirth, Angelica can't go to the Battle of Yorktown because she has to go have a baby, but she catches up a few weeks later. They're remarkable.
Because it's amazing how they just plowed on.
Absolutely.
They'd have these children and just, or they'd be pregnant and just carry on, and it's really impressive.
My favorite thing about the child care is how often children are sent to live with other people. They say children behave better in other people's households, so they'll go stay with this friend for a while and this friend, read their books and learn how they're. I'm like, who will take my children? Will someone please take them?
Yeah, those were the days. Yeah, that's right. I've seen that in some of the letters I've read of women in England too. Okay, is it time to take questions from the audience, or?
We can certainly head that way. We've got some nice ones, but do you have another, Julie, that you want to ask, or you want to tip to us, whatever you prefer?
Well, I was going to ask, this is something you kind of touched upon, but do you think that, when Angelica was in Europe, she kept Jefferson and Adams and Alexander Hamilton pretty much, she worked to keep them in good relationships with each other. And of course, they all felt they were pursuing a common cause. And then when she got back to the United States, that all kind of disintegrated. Do you think in the end she felt kind of disillusioned about the new nation and the whole project, or not? Just based on because it was kind of sad to see how everybody, once the United States was established, all this competition set in and people quit agreeing.
Yeah, well, I think it's like every post-war generation sees that, we worked so hard, we fought this battle, and what are you kids doing with it? Seems to be a pattern you see in history, right? Yeah. So there's some disappointment, I think. And when you're fighting a battle and you're imagining what you're fighting for, it's an idea, and you're really uncomfortable sitting in Valley Forge, really like cold and trying to be like, well, when this is all over, it's going to be this like amazing thing. And, and it is an amazing thing, but it's work and it's time, and it has, it's an everyday struggle. Like life is an everyday struggle. You can have the perfect wedding and the marriage will still take work every single day. And I think the nation took work every single day. And I don't think she really suffered from the losses in her family, and that did derail her. But I think when she got back up and headed out west to join the next, she's part of the movement that's the French and Indian War. She's part of the movement that's colonialism. She's part of the movements that's, the zeitgeist, like the American Revolution. Like, okay, now we're doing the next thing. The French Revolution. She's doing the next thing, and I think the next thing was like, okay, what is American? Like, what are these American towns, these American societies going to look like? And she, went out into Western New York and designed a town after Paris with an arrondissement in the middle, and invited her French friends, the Duponts, and there's several French families who settled there initially. Her son was not so charming as her, and things got messy. But initially it was going to be, we're going to live in the country in this sort of like idyllic. We talk about Marie Antoinette's like pastoralism, like Angelica took it to a totally new level.
Yeah.
But
so there was a new chapter.
There was a new, the next thing we're going to, yes, I think there were things that she mourned along the way, but, but I think the sort of the country, which changed for her, right? The country was Albany, the country was the colony of New York, the country was the sort of United States. So the country is like, the actual not in war United States, like that it keeps shifting. But she seems to embrace it.
Our questioners are mostly going back to her American Revolutionary time period. But this is so interesting what you're saying. So just bringing us back a little bit, one question is, did any of your research reveal Angelica's politics, Federalist versus Republican, or did she dance between the two?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. From her specifically, she definitely liked to walk the line between. She liked, when her husband had to deal with Aaron Burr, she took Aaron Burr to a party as her guest soon after, even though they were opposite parties. And Aaron Burr had unseated her father in the Senate, and there were a lot of feelings about that. And the fact that she was friends with both Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, who really were leaders of opposing parties, and they both admired her and they both confided in her and wrote to her. That's pretty emblematic of her taking that middle space. But her politics she's a Federalist. Her children are maybe not Federalists. I think they lean, her daughter elopes also, her daughter Betsy, named after Elizabeth Hamilton.
A tradition.
Yeah, it's a family tradition. And bizarrely, Angelica and John are like, what? Like, can you believe this? And so they're like, we're breaking ties with her, and so on. But her husband was, I think a Burrite. And then there's Robert Livingston, with whom Angelica's extremely close, and he is, a prominent Democratic Republican. And when he goes to France as a minister plenipotentiary there, he encourages Angelica to write to him, not of anything seriously, but he wants France to remember that she's his cousin, as he's negotiating the Louisiana Purchase with Talleyrand, who Angelica got out of France when he was in trouble.
We have a question that's asking about your research project. This is your first book, Art Process. Were there sources that surprised you and changed your ideas about Angelica, or are there things that you really loved seeing in archives?
Yeah. Oh, this is just the most fun I've had researching this book. And I, like I said, I didn't know if there would be anything, and I didn't know what I'd find or if I'd like her. I had a lot of anxiety about, who is this woman? Is she someone we should write a book about? And when I started, even just like superficially, asking in my hometown, where, the Angelica Free Library has archives from that family in the library. And then I got in touch with the people who own her home, and they had me over, and we had mad scanning, festivals to they just had so much material. But the letters, the Library of Congress has her letters. The University of Virginia has her letters with Thomas Jefferson. Hobart William Smith has her letters. The Massachusetts Historical Society has letters that reference her, through the, there are just so many letters. She's mentioned in all the newspapers. So in terms of figuring out where she was, almost month by month through her life, I can place her with a document. That was amazing. But the most amazing things were things like the woman who grew up visiting the house in Angelica, New York, where where she would spend the summers at the end of her life. She did not spend her winters in the snow belt of Western New York. She went back to the city. Let other people do that. But this woman, when she was a little girl, used to dig in the middens in the dumps behind the house looking for pottery shards, because of course Angelica's seven, has all her fancy dishes, and she has a filing cabinet of little pieces of those dishes that she found as a kid, all sorted, and so there have been people keeping this story very carefully and tending it, and it just, as soon as I was asking, everyone was like, "Oh yeah, here's her bed, here's her coffee pot, here's her dish." Wow. So it was there, and it was abundant. It was amazing to see it, because I thought women's stories weren't out there.
We, of course, have some questions on genealogy, because much of our audience is focused on family history. One listener thinks it would have been helpful to include a genealogy chart in light of the fact that she comes from such a large family with so many generations. And another question refers to the fact that you have used some major New York names here, the Van Rensselaers, the Livingstones, and that you talked about the importance of family connections in her life, in her parents' life specifically. How important were these family connections to her? Did she continue this thought of continuing Dutch culture, which is what you said her family was about? Mm-hmm. And did her descendants do the same? Did the Dutch culture live on past her, as far as you can see?
Yeah. Okay, so Angelica is, for you genealogists out there, Angelica's mother is Catherine Van Rensselaer, whose mother was Angelica Livingston. So Angelica Schuyler is named after a Livingston. And then her father, Philip Schuyler, his mother is Cornelia Van Cortlandt. So you have the Van Rensselaers, the Livingstons, the Cortlandts, and the Schuylers all right there in her immediate bloodline. You don't even have to go very far back. She definitely is connected to the Livingston family. She spends a lot of time at Livingston Manor or in Rhinebeck with that family. Janet Livingston Montgomery, she's very close with and spends a lot of time with her. So she's close to. So she does maintain those ties. When she goes to England, you have Margaret Kemble Gage, who is Thomas Gage's, the British commander, Thomas Gage's wife. He met her in New York. He was, she's Dutch, she's a distant cousin of Angelica's, and she threw a birthday party for her daughter. So she definitely worked with those family lines, and they were a source of power for her. But it's also a time in which genealogy and politics are very close. I mean, when you have the monarchies, everybody, it's, as much about family as it is about geography. If you're looking at Europe at this point, Maria Theresa anyway, it's all
who you're hanging out with as well. Yeah.
But I don't think she did. I think she, marrying an Englishman, her children did spend time as children, in their youth, in the house in Albany, and probably spoke some Dutch. But no, they learned French and Italian. I mean, I think she was going for the global cosmopolitan.
So we have one last question here from Olivia, a wild card question. There's so many good questions out there. And then I'll come back and we'll head toward the end here.
Of course, we have a question about Angelica and Hamilton and the possible affair. And I'm wondering, too, your thoughts on Hamilton and how, Angelica has been portrayed over time and what your goals were in this book and how, you would like to see people remember her.
Yeah. I mean, I was open to finding what the research showed me. And that's what's in the book. And so also you have to read the book because, you'll see where there are time periods where an affair was possible. But, she visits the United States one time between 1783 and 1797. And so, so I think readers can go through this book and see their relationship and her relationship with her sister and her relationship with the larger family and the way she's seen by society, right? Like how she's like where she has power, where and when she loses power. And I think readers can draw conclusions from that uniquely from where I am. I was careful to stick with the record, and frequently there's not a record. If you did have an affair with your closest sister's spouse, you would maybe not record that. But I would, I think for historians trying to explain why Angelica is so present in the historical record, it's an easy answer. Someone must have loved her. Oh, it must have been an affair with Thomas Jefferson. It must have been a love. I mean, and she's very saucy. Like she writes all, she's very like double entendre, and Alexander Hamilton will engage that. So their letters are extremely flirtatious and affectionate. And sometimes Elizabeth has a postscript on it. So, how they speak but it's there. It's in the book. I think people will draw conclusions. I didn't report anything that I couldn't substantiate. Well,
we're so grateful to you for sticking with the facts. And I just want to mention before she cycles off that Julie Fafel is in the UK right now. And we are so grateful to you for your time zone hopping for us. So grateful. And Molly Beer is in Ann Arbor. So she is not close by. And of course, Olivia and I are right here in Boston. But we are so grateful to both of you for this fascinating dialogue. And as we do for all our authors in the American Inspiration Author Series, we've asked Molly to read from her biography of Angelica, just to give you a quick taste of it. And then we really will close for the evening. But Molly, over to you for that reading.
Absolutely. And okay, so I'm going to read from the beginning because I'm a professor and we start at the beginning. So this is, as I told you, in 1766. Angelica is not yet Angelica. She's been Engeltia until she's invited to New York with Sir Henry Moore and his wife. And this is that trip. At 2 o'clock on an October Saturday, to a serenade of church bells and a salute from the battery guns, Governor Moore's barge docked at New York, and Angelica, her English name already shortened by the Moors to Anna, entered the star-shaped fort guarding the river's mouth, the island of Manhattan, and the governor's mansion, which stood within the ramparts. Thus far, Governor Moore had had no need for such protection, but the province of New York was spoiling for a fight. The governor's job as chief representative of the British Empire, of King George III himself, was to maintain control, to avert or suppress unrest, and to govern. The more rigorous royalists in New York, those in the military especially, already found Sir Harry convivial to a fault. Meanwhile, Angelica had watched Henry Moore playing his violin and striving to placate all sides, breaking bread and telling funny stories to form friendships and alliances, parenting other families' children, all to keep the fragile peace for as long as possible. His technique may have been failing, but Angelica Schuyler absorbed the lesson well. As a girl, she would never have the option of wielding a sword. Even grasping a pen would require some audacity. A dinner table, she was learning, was as much a chessboard as any battlefield, One could cut meat either place, but it was reason, not canons, that distinguished humans from beasts. Quote, they pleased everyone in the circle around them. One girl of Angelica's circle would remember of the Moor's soft power civility. Before the tempest broke loose all its fury, it was like oil poured on agitated waters, which produces a temporary calm immediately round the ship. End quote. Governor Moore would not live to see that tempest, but Angelica Schuyler was sailing straight for the coming fury.
Thank you so much, Molly, for
Thank
shedding
you.
such light on this remarkable woman, on colonial America, and also the American Revolution and the woman's experience there, one particularly amazing woman. Thank you. A reminder to our audience, specially signed copies of the biography Angelica can be purchased through our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. As you order on the bookstore's website, do input the code AMINS25 and your book will come signed by Molly on a book plate. The bookstore can send these special copies anywhere in the US. You can get one for yourself or as a gift, maybe stuff one away for the holidays, perhaps. Now, winding down our evening, Olivia has some news and upcoming events at Massachusetts Historical Society to share. Olivia, over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. We have some great programs coming up on Tuesday, November 4th for our seminar programs, which discuss cutting-edge research and papers in progress. We will have Julie Dubrow discussing Love and Loss After Wounded Knee, a biography of an extraordinary interracial marriage with Philip J. Deloria. And then on Tuesday, November 18th, we'll have Kevin Talek Marston and Mike Cronin presenting their new book, Inventing the Boston Game, Football, Soccer, and the Origins of a National Myth, in conversation with Louisa Thomas. We would love to see you there, of course, and you can find more events and ways to be involved with the MHS on our website, which is listed on the screen. And thank you to Molly and Julie for such a wonderful discussion. Margaret and Kathleen at American Ancestors for partnering, and everybody who's tuning in tonight. Back to you, Margaret.
Thank you so much, Olivia. It's been such a pleasure. We at American Ancestors are delighted to have co-presented tonight's talk with you. If you are researching a time, a person, or a family, definitely go to Massachusetts Historical Society, and definitely remember my colleagues are here to help you too. You'll see on screen some of the many educational programs ahead hosted by our Brew Family Learning Center. Many of them are free to the public. Also, as a free service, you can chat with one of our genealogists. Better yet, visit us, visit our new edition, the Family Heritage Experience at 97 Newbury Street, to see firsthand what we do here in Boston. Our mission and all we do is to educate, inspire, and connect. And for you literary sorts, first, I especially want to thank our sponsor for free programming in this author series, Susan Kay and John D. Thompson. Thank you both. We hope, all of us do, that you'll join us for more author talks ahead. On October 8, we're delighted to present Native Nations, the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, and its author, Kathleen Duval. She won for history. She will be in dialogue with the NYU historian Nicole Eustace. This event is in partnership with the Boston Public Library and GBH Forum Network. On October 15, we're looking at lineage in the colonial era. Brown University professor Karen Wolf will reveal how genealogy was a powerful force that shaped society in 18th century America. The remarkable Harvard historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich will join Professor Wolf in a discussion, and Mass Historical Society will again be our partner in that program. And on October 23rd, we will be gathering in person in our historic rotunda on Newbury Street and virtually online in celebration of the life and work of the acclaimed historian David McCullough. You'll hear from his daughter, Dory Lawson, about her father's life and the wisdom shared in his new collection of essays, History Matters. She'll be joined by moderator Ryan J. Woods, president and CEO of American Ancestors. This event is on the eve of the Boston Book Festival, and they are our partners in this. Join us, join them over the course of that weekend right afterward. It's a great time to be in Boston. So we hope you'll come in person on the 23rd or join us online if you're at a distance. But back to tonight, our many thanks to tonight's guest speakers, Molly Beer and Julie Flavel. Thank you also to our tech producer, Kathleen McKenzie, as Olivia said, and even more so to you, our audience and participants from Massachusetts Historical Society. Olivia and I appreciate and applaud your interest in America's history. We hope to see you again, but for now, a very good night to all, and do keep reading.